Hey everyone, welcome from Setup to Lockdown, a complete guide to Amazon S3 security configuration. Today we're excited to bring you through all the best practices to make sure that your Amazon S3 buckets are securely configured, make sure that you're preventing data breaches whenever possible, and other sorts of nasty attacks that a bad actor can take on your environment. My name's Connor. I'm the product manager here at Cloud Storage Security, and I'm here with Velzar, who is the customer success manager, also here at CSS. With that being said, we're going to jump right into it and quickly cover what we're going to be going over today. So, we're going to start with visibility. How do you know what's in your buckets? How do you know what's happening to your buckets? Who's taking actions on them? So on and so forth. Access control. Who has the ability to actually go into those buckets and make changes, making sure that you're enforcing least privilege at all times. Data security, how to keep the data within your buckets actually safe, secure, and inaccessible to a bad actor or someone who shouldn't be touching that data. Disaster recovery, backups, making sure that if the worst does happen, that you're actually prepared and you can restore production as fast as possible, and also compliance as a part of that, making sure that you're not going to get a big fine from a compliance uh, framework as a result of a violation. Data classification, making sure you know where your sensitive data is, and then data protection and malware scanning, making sure that no data is sitting in your S3 bucket to eventually be distributed downstream to your partners, your employees, or your customers. So with that, Velzar is going to pull up his screen, and we are going to actually hop into the console and show you guys how we configure our buckets, some of the things that you need to think of, um, and what you need to do to actually make sure that your buckets are safe.
Awesome. I'll go ahead and steal the screen from you here, Connor. And let's get into it. I know the first thing we want to focus on here is visibility. Connor, do you want to talk to us a little bit about visibility, about storage lens, event logging, AWS config, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing we want to cover is S3 storage lens. So it's used as kind of insights for your buckets to see usage and activity, and actually figure out what is in your buckets. So you should enable it mostly when you want to have a complete view of storage and activity for S3 across all of the AWS accounts. So it kind of gives you that central visibility of what's going on there. You should also turn it on when you want to receive SCC or secure configuration or best practice recommendations after you actually spin up new S3 buckets. So it's actually very good at telling you what's in your buckets. Okay, are they movie files? Are they MP3s? What are they? Your total storage. And they're especially useful for organizations that have a ton of buckets everywhere. They're constantly being spun up, deleted, modified, changed. It's a good way to kind of make sure that you have that visibility start to end. So you can go to S3 and then storage lens and then dashboards in the AWS console, and then you could go ahead and enable that. Some things to think about when you're thinking about storage lens is kind of overlooking some of the more important or maybe unused storage metrics. Velzar, do you have anything to kind of add there? What you think might be important that people miss?
Yeah, I would say making sure that you're when you have it turned on, you're actually looking at the metrics, just like you said. And then a big portion of it is as well. Storage Lens can generate alerts and recommendations. Just make sure you aren't ignoring those either. So, and I should also mention making sure that it's enabled for organization-wide visibility, not just for a single AWS account.
Absolutely. Awesome. With storage lens kind of covered, the next thing we want to kind of talk about is S3 event logging, right? So you can enable that with CloudTrail, and then you get the S3 server access logs to track the API and the object activity to kind of know who accessed objects, what happened, who took that action, and when they actually did that. So we'll quickly go over, if you aren't aware, the difference between CloudTrail data events, and then S3 server access logs. They're kind of the largest form of logging that you'll find in AWS. A lot of people utilize them. So CloudTrail logs API calls when we're talking about S3 on the bucket level. CloudTrail data events will log those API calls on the object level, and then S3 server access logs will log access calls so to those objects, just to kind of differentiate there. Different use cases for all three, but we think that you should use S3 event logging when you need to meet compliance requirements, audit requirements, to kind of show evidence of when something was accessed and by whom, right? So there is a forensics component there. There's also an audit component as well. And then you can also use it to detect anomalies for data access in your S3 buckets. So let's think of thousands of sensitive files, maybe combined with a data classification solution being accessed at the same time. That's something that would be surfaced by S3 event logging that you can then go and look at and then remediate appropriately. You can turn it on by going to the CloudTrail console, and then you go to CloudTrail data events under the CloudTrail service in the AWS console. And then you go to the management section of your S3 bucket as well. It's where you can turn them on. Some things to kind of think about is what critical buckets do you have? What has sensitive information? What has information that's actually going to end up at your downstream users, right? So more times than not, it could be sensitive. It could actually be business critical. So maybe not sensitive in a sense that it's been regulated, but it could be something like source code, trade secrets, IP that your company might have. Those are all other forms of sensitive data that you want to make sure if somebody's trying to access them or possibly exfiltrate them. Another thing to think about is kind of ignoring the API activity alerts. So I talked about it earlier. There's indicators of breaches that can come through these S3 event logs. So you want to make sure that if you see an anomaly, if you detect an anomaly, you're a DevOps person, you notice that something weird is going on, you want to make sure that you investigate and act on that appropriately. We've seen it happen a multitude of times. And then the last one is an interesting one. So it's actually storing logs in the same bucket without additional protection. So if you save your CloudTrail logs or access logs in the same S3 bucket that you're monitoring, and you don't go ahead and apply stricter controls to those logs, you're actually exposing, you're actually going to risk exposing those logs or maybe even overwriting those logs in the event of a misconfiguration or in the worst case, a security breach, a data breach, something else to think of. With that being covered, we'll talk about AWS config. So AWS config ensures that configurations, adhere to security policies and compliance standards in your existing resources. So you should use it when you need to meet compliance, audit requirements, internal or external, making sure that you have everything set up correctly. And you should also enable it when you need to track configuration history. And also go ahead and remediate any configuration issues that might pop up. So it's with for companies that have hundreds, thousands of buckets, it's pretty difficult to keep all of them configured correctly at the same time, especially when in the end, they're actually meant to be somewhat disposable, right? Elastic and agile. So create, edit, delete, all in a very, very easy fashion. That's kind of the one of the benefits of the cloud. So another thing that you need to monitor, like we're talking about today, is how everything is set up. Some things to think about when you're using config is neglecting to review the config changes flagged by config itself. So you want to make sure that that somebody or someone is appropriately monitoring and making sure they're remediating any issues that might come up. Misconfiguring the config rules, so leading to false positives or negatives, got to pay attention. And then overlooking the integration of config with other monitoring tools. One that comes to mind, and correct me if I'm wrong here, Velzar, but it would be Security Hub, kind of centralizing all of those alerts. A similar SIM platform is also stuff that config could send to through Security Hub.
Yep.
With that, I'll pass it over to Velzar. He's going to talk about access control.
Awesome. Thanks, Connor. So now that we've talked about visibility, let's talk a little bit about managing access control. And there's a couple things here that I'll cover real quick. One being bucket policies. So bucket policies allow you to define permissions at the bucket level. A couple things to think about as you're creating bucket policies on a bucket is you want to make sure you're not defining overly permissive policies, such as granting wildcards, for example, which we're all guilty of a lot of the time. Along with that, you want to make sure you're restricting access by IP or VPC if necessary as well. Don't forget there is a networking component to all of this. And then as you're implementing bucket policies, make sure that you're actually testing the policy changes and seeing how the behavior changes as you're implementing it. Because a lot of the time, bucket policies can have a downstream impact on your application or whatever is trying to access the bucket, or it may be a human rather than an application. So testing whatever you implement is going to be crucial for any bucket policy. One other piece I will talk about when it comes to permissions is access control lists. So for ACLs, you want to make sure that if they're set up, they'll impact the bucket and the object, or both at the bucket and object levels. When you're using ACLs, uh, you'll want to make a decision on, is it better to use access control lists or is it better to use bucket policies or IAM roles? You want to make sure that you can figure out what's most manageable. Along with that, um, don't forget to look at the object level and what permissions are set at the object level. Sometimes we found that folks will set up access control lists at the bucket level, but overlook the object level, and that could cause sensitive data to be leaked. And then, along with that, make sure you account for inherited ACL settings when moving or copying objects, because a lot of that can be impacted if you're moving and copying objects to and from your S3 bucket. One last thing I'll mention as well is access points. So when it comes to access points, you can set them up here again directly through the bucket. Couple things to note when it comes to access points. You'll want to make sure that you leverage access points if you have complex multi-user or multi-region setups. Um, Usually it's best to look at all of these different options and figure out what fits and what doesn't. You know, it's not required to use all of these, but you'll want to make sure that you review each of them. Along with that, if you create an access point here, and you no longer use it eventually, if you no longer use it, you want to make sure to disable it. So leaving unused access points can cause security risks downstream and further down the line. And then along with that, whatever it is that you configure for access points, make sure that it's configured correctly. A lot of the time, if something's misconfigured when it comes to access points, it could lead to access issues downstream as well. So far, I do want to reiterate a lot of the pieces that we've covered. Uh, I think the central points here, Connor, are don't ignore what's generated by all of these different options and settings and tools, but also make sure that you're thinking further ahead when it comes to all of this configuration, because if you're not, it could impact you further down the line. So with that said, I'll hand it off back to you, Connor. Let's talk a little bit about uh, uh, data durability and S3 object lock.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about data durability, the top solution to that, or something that you can do to enhance data durability in AWS, like Velzar said, is to go into object lock. If you're protecting critical data, if you have compliance requirements that kind of mandate data retention, or when you want to manage deletion rights and don't really want to bother with full permissions using ACLs as Velzar talked about, that's when you want to kind of set up S3 object lock. So you can get to the object lock section. You see it on Velzar's screen there under the properties of the S3 bucket. You can also find it under the advanced settings section when you're creating a new bucket. But when you're setting up object lock, you want to make sure that in order to prevent people from deleting data, if someone's in your environment, maybe it's an internal user, maybe it's external threat actor, um, Might as well enable it during bucket creation, especially when you're building a critical application or workflow that's going to be processing sensitive or otherwise business critical data. Um, you don't want to use overly long retention periods as well. So that can kind of complicate data management in a way. If you're keeping very long retention periods, then you're going to have to kind of manage that in that manner. And then neglecting to use or rather test object lock functionality for compliance scenarios. So if you have a regulation that requires you to retain data for a certain amount of time, you want to make sure that that object lock truly does prevent that from happening in a certain amount of time. You don't want to risk compliance violation. Another thing that you can actually do to enhance data durability is to go and enable MFA delete. So MFA delete adds kind of an extra layer of protection by requiring confirmation before data deletion. So they have to go into their MFA account and they have to certify that it kind of adds that extra layer of security. So when you want to prevent accidental or unauthorized deletions, like I said earlier, internal or an external threat, or maybe just an accident too. You also want to kind of safeguard data from compromised credentials, right? So we see in the Codefinger um, attacks that were pretty recent, AWS credentials were compromised. The threat actors got access to an AWS account, and then they went ahead and kicked off a ransomware event. And when they're in there, that ransomware event is just one of many things that they could do when they have access to your AWS account. And deleting objects is one of them. So MFA delete could possibly prevent that from happening. So in order to enable it, you got to go into the AWS CLI. Um, it's an S3 API command. It's a put bucket versioning, and then you basically just you enter in a couple lines of code, and then you can enable it for that bucket. A common pitfall, I'm sure we're all thinking it, but forgetting to document or back up MFA devices, risking lockout. Happens all the time. Someone loses their phone, they don't back it up, they don't have their secret keys or the recovery keys. And then in that case, it becomes very difficult, if not impossible, to go ahead and delete objects if you actually need to, or do any of the other things that MFA requires when you're logging into AWS. I think that just about covers it for data durability. I'm going to pass it back over to Velzar, and he's going to talk about disaster recovery.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about disaster recovery, and it also kind of relates to compliance as well. But it's this concept of cross-region replication, and you can set up replication rules for a bucket in S3 where you can ensure that data is copied to another region. And that can help you with compliance and disaster recovery. If you need to comply with a regulation or compliance framework that requires you to have data copied geographically and make your data storage geographically diverse, you can do so through a replication rule. And along with that, this is a great way to also recover from regional outages. So if US East 1 goes down, you could have data copied over to US East 2 or US West 1, and so on and so forth. A couple things to keep in mind when it comes to using replication rules and just cross-region replication in general is you want to make sure that you have versioning enabled on both your source and destination buckets. That is a requirement for replication in this case. Along with that, you'll want to make sure that you monitor replication metrics for any errors or any delays. Obviously, nothing is perfect in this world, so making sure that you have visibility into what's going on as things are being replicated is crucial. And then along with that, when it comes to IAM roles and permissions, that can lead to replication failures at the end of the day. So just make sure that you have IAM roles configured properly when it comes to using replication rules. So with all that said, Connor, I'll go ahead and kick it back to you, and let's cover a little bit about the management of the data itself and classification of the data itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we talk about data classification, right, it's extremely important to understand where your sensitive data is, what it is, and how sensitive it actually might be. So when we talk about things that are, again, I'll go back to internally sensitive data, source code, IP, things like that. That's something that if you lose, it might it's going to be a massive headache. But there's also other data, right? When we think of organizations that process payment card data under PCI DSS, uh, losing that data or having a data breach will land you some sort of fine. You might have to pay for credit monitoring for your customers. So that's a whole different animal, frankly. So when we talk about data classification and the management of that data, Amazon Macy is the native solution that is brought up. So for compliance audits, or maybe even when sharing demo data or third party data, you can use Macy with AWS Lambda and then Event Bridge for automation. So uh, you definitely do not want to, when you're thinking about configuring and actually going ahead and configuring Macy, don't want to exclude any critical buckets. So it happens all the time. There might be some sort of application or workflow that will process very important, very sensitive data. Want to make sure that you're capturing everything you can. So that's one thing. Relying solely on Macy without the follow up and remediation steps, right? So if it shows that there's a bunch of sensitive data in this certain bucket, making sure that you're remediating, making sure that you're following these best practices and actually making sure that it is locked down is extremely important. And we've seen that happen as well. Um, and then ignoring the cost implications. So frequent scanning a lot of the time can get pretty expensive when you think about it. So especially if you're rescanning, um, it can be expensive. So keep those cost implications in mind as well. Another thing to cover on the data classification part is lifecycle rules. So you want to use them, when you want to automate data transitions to storage tiers, or even permanent deletion based on the rules that you kind of come up with. So when you think about it, there might be some data that you're not going to touch. It might actually be part of a yearly review. Maybe it needs to be in cold storage. So you can actually configure lifecycle rules to automate pushing that data down into colder storage where you're going to save money. And frankly, it's just not needed in Amazon S3. So you can go to S3 buckets and then in management, and you can just define your lifecycle rules here. Belzar has it up on the screen. When you're thinking about configuring lifecycle rules, data deletion is something that you need to make sure that you're handling properly and thinking very hard about the possibility of setting up an automation that's going to delete your data. So there might be temporary files that you ingest that are no longer needed. Maybe they're sensitive. Then you can set up a lifecycle rule in that current bucket to make sure that they're gone. But otherwise, it can be pretty difficult. Another thing is kind of forgetting to monitor the cost impact of moving data between storage classes. So if there are lifecycle rules that make kind of large scale changes, bringing stuff down into colder storage and then bringing back that up into Amazon S3 between Glacier, as an example, there is a cost impact there. So keep that in mind. Last thing is overly broad rules that might affect unintended objects. So buckets that are more general purpose that might not be a part of a workflow. Maybe there's something that your marketing team uses. That's kind of you know, all that data is dumped in there. Applying lifecycle rules could affect those objects. So just be careful about that and think of the scope that these lifecycle rules are going to kind of they're going to reach in a certain way. So yeah, that's about it for data classification and management. Again, kicking it back over to Velazar to talk about malware protection.
Awesome. So let's talk a little bit about malware protection. When it comes to S3 and malware protection, you want to make sure that you're scanning data when it enters your bucket, or even before it enters your bucket. That way you can make sure that the data is clean and you can minimize any downstream effects of a piece of malware, a virus ending up on someone's machine, like a customer, a partner, an employee, a user, so on and so forth. So natively, Amazon offers guard duty with their S3 scanning solution as a feature of that of guard duty. You also have other options like our own antivirus for Amazon S3 solution, where we can scan AWS buckets, EBS volumes, EFS volumes, FSX volumes, so on and so forth. And we also, not only can we scan these storage volumes, but we also complement GuardDuty really well, where you can use both us and GuardDuty if you needed to perform things like scanning with additional engines, for example. A couple of things to look out for when you are scanning, whether it's using GuardDuty, our solution, or anything else for malware in S3, is you want to make sure that you're scanning with multiple engines and increasing the efficacy of your scan. Obviously, not every single scanning engine is going to be able to catch everything that's out there, and every single engine has different virus signatures, virus definitions. So if you increase the efficacy of your scan with additional scanning engines, you can ensure that you can catch just about everything that's out there. The more you scan with, the better your results will be. Along with that, you'll want to make sure that you're scanning not only data as it enters, but you're scanning data subsequently after the fact. The viruses of today, the virus definitions of today are not going to be the same as a week from now, a month from now, 6 months from now, a year from now. So having some type of periodic subsequent scans is going to be crucial as well. And I should also mention, you'll want to make sure that you create a baseline for all of your pre-existing data as well. So creating that baseline will ensure that all of your pre-existing files are clean and there's no downstream effects that can be experienced if something were to be infected. And then once you're scanning all new files, you'll be able to ensure all of your data is clean. Last thing I'll mention is here at Cloud Storage Security, we have a belief that you should have a scan everything approach to ensure all of your data in S3 is safe and sound. So no matter what it is, even if it's internally generated, you want to make sure that you're scanning it, because the more that you're scanning and the more buckets that you have, as you're experiencing this bucket sprawl and storage volume sprawl, it's going to be harder to manage all of those storage volumes and harder to manage all those buckets. So it's important to be able to have a solution in place that allows you to scan everything and anything periodically and frequently. So with that said, Connor, I'll go ahead and give you back the screen. And yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah. So from our side, that's about all you need to set up and kind of configure your Amazon S3 buckets. We think that if you apply these best practices correctly, prevent data breaches. Just last week, there was a huge data breach. A very large U.S. based shipping company leaked 14 million shipping records. So all of that information is now on the public internet, and then a bad actor can go ahead and take their contact information, work it into social engineering schemes. They could sell it. Um, they could go, try to impersonate the company as well. So it's just kind of a massive rabbit hole and not good for anyone involved. So
And I think it's important to also note you should really look at your storage volumes, your S3 buckets, a few different ways. You should look at the files themselves and protect those files and make sure that they're free of malware, make sure that they're free of PII, unless they're safe and sound if they have PII. And then along with that, you should look at the storage volumes themselves at the configuration and infrastructure level, where you have things properly configured and you're minimizing downstream risk and downstream effects. And along with that, you're paying attention to all of the different information that's generated by all of these native options through AWS. So it's really crucial to just make sure that things are configured properly and you're paying attention to everything. I know that as that storage volume sprawl happens, it's going to be tougher and tougher. But having tools in place and configurations in place to manage that sprawl is going to help you in the long run, make sure that things are secure.
absolutely, yeah. So Velzar covered a lot about this, how cloud storage security helps. But so I'll run through this real quick. Um, we do in-tenant malware protection for all the AWS storage services as well as GCP. And like he said, we emphasize a programmatic, a scan everything approach. So we think that there's many ways that even if your organization only generates internal data in the cloud, there's ways that malware can still find its way in there and then downstream to your employees to detonate on their local machines. So we give customers scanning for everything you see on the screen: S3, EBS, EFS, all the way down to Azure Blob and Google Cloud Storage. And what our customers really like about it is, number one, that's in tenant. We don't touch your data. We don't move it anywhere. We don't copy it to a service account. It doesn't go to our account. Um, they also like how we have premium malware scanning engines. So we have three total that allows you to really reduce false negative and false positive rates. We also have a number of configurable scanning models, so you can customize it to your internal and external needs. If you have some pretty strict compliance requirements, we do scheduled scanning. So you can set it up quarterly, monthly, whatever you need to do to satisfy those. We have event-based scanning. So as data is actually dropped into an S3 bucket or an EBS volume, you can scan that data. And we have API scanning, which allows you to scan it for malware before it even lands in the bucket. So there's a lot of customization you can do there, fit it right into your workflow, and make sure that you're meeting compliance requirements as well as internal requirements as well. We also do quarantining from the console. Super easy. You pick the destination bucket where you want all the infected files to go, and then you click OK, and that's how it works. We also have some pretty cool remediation options our customers like. So Velazar and I do a series where we obtain malware samples and we actually detonate them and actually see what they do. So we have dynamic malware detonation, which we send it off to a cloud sandbox and then detonate it, figure out what IPs it connects to, how it maps to the MITRE attack matrix, and most importantly, what it actually might do if it detonated on a local machine. So our customers really like that next layer of coverage, that they'd say, and investigation and possibly forensics as well. With that being said, thanks everybody for attending. We're going to stick around in a couple minutes here, just for some questions. I think we might have one, but if you're going to head out right now, if you want to learn more, you can reach out to us at sales@cloudstorage.com, or you can also head to AWS Marketplace and try us out for 30 days free. So we give you a set amount of data. You can actually go deploy. It takes just about 15 minutes to configure, and then get started and figure out if it works for your organization. Thanks everyone for attending. Let's see if we have any questions. Okay. Yeah, we have one on malware scanning. I'll read it out. Um, what are the benefits of in-tenant malware scanning? Yeah. Elzar, you want to take this?
Sure. So when it comes to in-tenant malware scanning, what we mean by that is we want to make sure that all of that data that you're scanning stays within your environment, within your AWS account. And in the case of our solution, not only in your account, but in the region that it's in. So if you have requirements around data residency, for example, that data probably cannot leave the region that it's in. So it's crucial to make sure that it's in that same region, that it's being scanned in that same region. And then along with that, um, there's a lot of scanning solutions that are out there where the data may leave the AWS account. It may leave even the AWS environment as well and be sent back to the solution provider's infrastructure to be scanned. So with our solution, you're able to scan within your AWS account, within the region. We have absolutely no access to your files either. So we can't see what you're scanning. We don't know what you're scanning. And I do also want to mention it's a byte for byte scan. So we are scanning files fully. It's not just a lookup of the hash of the file or anything like that. It is a full scan of the file against virus signatures that are provided by engine vendors. So it's really crucial because you don't know what's in a lot of these files. So if the file's leaving the environment, you don't know where it's going to end up and or whose hands it's going to be in or what they'll be able to do with the file or what they'll be able to see. So I think those are really the big points there when it comes to in-tenant scanning.
Thanks, Felazar. I don't see any other questions at the moment. So that being said, yeah, tune into our next webinar. We're actually going to be looking at the top malware families of January 2023. So we have the samples. We're excited to do it. We're actually going to bring them up. We're going to detonate them. We're going to figure out what they actually will do. They detonate on a local machine. And kind of give you that visibility. Okay, how nasty are these? What are they going to do? Are they going to take my credentials? Are they going to exfiltrate my sensitive data? Keyloggers? What are they? So we're really excited to go ahead and do that. That's going to go live next week on the 27th. So make sure you register for that on our Bright Talk page. And with that, thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks, everybody.